Hi everyone, my name is Vanessa and this is Juliet. And we're working with the Environmental Stewardship Office to help them reduce Colombia's greenhouse gas emissions from air travel. So why should you care about air travel emissions? Well, about 2% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions and 10 to 20% of university emissions come from air travel. And with the additional impacts of climate warming that emissions at high altitudes have, these numbers are much greater. Not only this, but air travel is estimated to triple by 2050. In addition, COP21 Paris Agreement, its goal is to limit mean global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which would be very difficult unless we take on aviation. That's partly why Colombia's recently released sustainability plan from 2017 to 2020 released its three main principles, which is to advance Colombia's research and outreach related to sustainable development. Secondly, to implement sustainability initiatives based on the research. And three, to foster a culture of sustainability. All of this led to our project objectives to track and calculate, reduce, and offset air emissions. With the strategies we produced through our research and analyses of how to approach these three main objectives, we want to emphasize that it's not a one-time deal. It's an ongoing cycle of tracking, reducing, and improving methods. So our first objective stems from a seemingly simple question: how much does a university fly? Well, a lot. Columbia in particular flies for athletics, faculty conferences and research, recruiting faculty and staff, study abroad, visiting professors, etc. We've determined that in order to reach the goal of creating an air travel greenhouse gas emissions inventory, we need to track miles flown and calculate emissions impact based off this and other factors. Ultimately, if we know how much we're emitting, we can assess ways to reduce emissions. And, well, how do we get this pertinent data? Well, we can start by tracking miles flown from travel reimbursement forms. We propose using travel reimbursement forms to track miles flown by asking questions that capture miles accurately, such as airport pairs, including layovers, multiple stops, and so on for each business trip, as well as flight stops in order to capture plane types, which would help us in the future perhaps pair up with airlines that have more efficient planes. Secondly, we propose using a CO2 emissions calculator that factors in miles flown based on distance. There are four major buckets: short, medium, long, and extended haul. Short haul is less than 300 miles. Medium haul is over 300 miles and less than 2,300 miles. Long haul would be over 2,300 miles and less than 5,000 miles. And extended haul would be over 5,000 miles. So this is a very complex calculator in comparison to other calculators which use just one emissions factors for every single business flight. So Juliet will now present on reducing and offsetting air travel.
Cool. Oh, this is exciting. So basically, we had our first objective, which was to figure out exactly how much the university flew. But then once we know that number, we have to figure out ways that the university can fly less. And the first set of actions that we came up with, which are ideas that the university can implement, are on this slide. So the mentality that we had when we were coming up with these options was to think about short-term, easier things that the university can do, things that are like low stress, high impact, and then also to think about in the long term, in an ideal universe, what are things that we can do that will make lasting change. So you can see on this slide that the first option is incentivizing greener options. So there's this university in California called Santa Clara University, and they have a policy that limits travel reimbursements for unnecessary travel. And they have an actual definition for unnecessary travel, which would be taking a plane when you could easily take a bus or train. So if Columbia did something like that and made it clear that that was what we were doing, it would be easy to change the consumer behavior, in this case, the behavior of affiliates who are traveling. The other option, which universities and a lot of private companies have begun using, is video conferencing. So video conferencing makes traveling for meetings that you could just as easily have, over the phone unnecessary. So we looked into options for video conferencing and made a few recommendations about companies that Columbia could use. And then the third option you'll see is change the school calendar, which you can all laugh about. Go ahead. Because it sounds crazy, right? But actually Santa Clara University, which I mentioned earlier, their academic year starts in early August instead of late August, and because of that, their semester ends right before Thanksgiving. So instead of having to fly home for Thanksgiving and then again for the winter holidays, they have this extended holiday, which means that their affiliates fly only once instead of twice in that 2-month period. So then our third objective was to offset air travel. And I'm sure everyone has heard something about offsets. Offsets can mean a range of things. Essentially, the goal is that you make up for the carbon that was emitted in the course of your travel. And so carbon offsets are a common way that people make up for this travel. Actually, 1 or 2 airlines have started offering the ability to purchase carbon offsets when you book a flight. The problem is that we don't really know what that means. And that's not just like us, that's just in general. It's really difficult to understand what people are doing with those carbon credits, where they're going, and how they're actually impacting the net CO2 emitted. So the other thing that people do and universities do is make donations and investments in green technology. But again, you don't know if that's exactly making up for the CO2 that was released in your flight. So we started looking again at more unusual solutions. We came across this company called Global Thermostat, which is created by 2 Columbia professors. And Global Thermostat says that they can actually pull CO2 from the atmosphere, and then they have a business model where they resell it to companies who use CO2. For instance, soda companies use CO2 in their canisters. So that's Global Thermostat's business model, and we were thinking about ways that Columbia could leverage that. And then our third option, again, is aspirational, but we hope that in the long term, Columbia will consider options for wide offset systems that include a lot of universities, where they can then leverage that bulk to make it have an airline partner in order to systematize carbon offsets. So what's next? We have to track and calculate our emissions, we have to reduce our emissions, and we have to offset our emissions. But this is a cycle. We can't do this one time. We have to continue to do it until we get to net zero. Now our group's going to come up.
So I have a question about the changing of the dates. What would that mean for athletes? Wouldn't that be kind of brutal? Because towards the end of the December, it's I don't know, active.
Yeah.
Well, obviously it's pretty aspirational to change the entire university calendar. So that's definitely something that needs a lot of thought behind it if they were to change the schedule. But there are universities like Stanford, for instance, their athletes fly carbon neutral because they offset all of the flights and buses and trains that, or however they actually mostly fly, but however they get to all of their competitions is completely offset. How, we're still trying to figure out, but that's one kind of solution to your question.
Very interesting. Quick question. What are airlines doing on their own to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and as a part of the transportation sector, and are they part of any of the international agreements?
So one of the problems is essentially that the airline coalitions that are currently in place are run by people from the industry, and so they haven't really been doing as much as they could. It makes more sense for airplanes to be more fuel efficient monetarily, and so they are working on that, but largely they're not part of any, expansive agreements of that nature.
And airline manufacturers are also making pretty substantial steps in trying to improve efficiency and improve carbon output from planes, just because it makes more sense. Their planes are lighter, cheaper. Planes are cheaper to fly, use less fuel. So the more efficient and the better the tech gets with the planes, the more efficient the planes get, and it's way more in the more advantageous for manufacturers, and that they're pushing on their own for that, and I think the airlines will start to follow behind that.
Thanks, guys. Job well done. I know that you had a lot of data and models to analyze before kind of coming down to these recommendations and conclusions. So good job. What are some of the other models and methodologies for tracking GHG? And what are some of the pros and cons behind those? Basically, what would you recommend for Columbia to do in terms of tracking?
So I guess that question is very specific to me, since I worked mostly on the methodology side. So there's an issue with methodology. There's no standardization across institutions, organizations, so everyone actually creates their own methodology using either greenhouse gas protocol as somewhat of a guideline. And so that's the biggest challenge we actually encounter, trying to figure out, okay, with which methodology is actually the best methodology to use that incorporates all the different factors that are essential for emissions. So we figured the DEFRA model was best because it incorporated, based on our research in terms of the literature, all the different elements that are necessary to be as precise as possible while allowing Columbia the ability to implement something fairly quick. But we're also trying to transition sometime in the near future, or encourage Columbia to transition in the near future to a model that allows the institution not only to decide, okay, fly or not to fly, but more efficient means of traveling. So you can figure out beforehand how efficient your aircraft is and choose a more efficient aircraft for that particular flight, because different aircrafts as we were saying earlier, the efficiency varies even across the same distance. So that's something that we're eventually hoping that they can transition to.
What is different?
Hi. So I sort of have two questions. One going off of what you were just saying. Were you at all able to get any numbers, either as far as how much the school is flying, or on the other side of that, looked into, for example, aircraft efficiency, what different airlines do in that sense? If different planes have different mileage, for example, or...
So planes, so firstly, to your first question, it's really hard to track airline miles. There's no centralized booking system. So other universities right now have a travel agency per se. Yale uses Orbit's business travel that goes by some other name, and so it was easy for them to pull all their mileage because all their affiliates are tracking through this centralized system, or I think it was 65% of their affiliates track through that system. We don't have that, so our closest option for finding this information was to go to accounts payable and in theory, go through all of the travel reimbursement forms. Unfortunately, they are still all on paper, and we were not allowed to go into their archives and go through all of the receipts. But luckily, because they are still on paper, accounts payable is trying to make an online form. So we've actually been meeting with them a lot to put in questions on it's called the TBER form, on the TBER form that will give us that flight information. So moving forward, we'll be able to have a better number, but we're really kind of flying in the dark here on how much we actually fly. And so right now we're trying to figure out a number based on peer institutions, and then kind of like using a ratio of how big we are compared to that peer institution. But Columbia flies a lot, especially with Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. There are a lot of, there's so much research around the world that there's definitely a lot of flying. And then second question, airplane models can differ in efficiency by up to like 70%. So like old planes are in comparison pretty inefficient. So you can look up the models and see like on like Boeing or whatever, if you're flying like a Boeing 747 like 300 or whatever it's called, you can look up on Boeing and they'll tell you all the specs, but there's no standardized system for figuring that out yet.
Sorry, just one last thing. This may seem a bit far-fetched, but did you guys at all consider looking at it maybe from more of like a political or policy perspective? So for example, maybe like putting a cap on the amount that like universities would be allowed to fly, or what that would entail? I know it seems far-fetched, but.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem far-fetched, but we did look into that as well. Part of the first reductions recommendation, incentivizing greener options, would be to disincentivize faculty from flying by limiting the amount that they can use towards that, especially for shorter flights. Yeah.
Just to add to that, the fact that we have no idea how the college is flying, we first figured that's the most essential step in this whole process, trying to figure out how much we're actually flying, and then transition to means and ways of trying to negate that.
It's definitely a long-term project,
Yeah.
especially because we have no data. We can't get data right now, like actual data from Columbia right now. But the TBER form the new form will hopefully go into effect. I think they're trying to push it out for over the summer. So once that gets going, it'll be pretty easy to scrape the data that we would need to find these numbers and then reduce and offset from that point on.
And at that point, we will not only have data, we will have exact data to the mile,
Yeah.
which is exciting.
To the seat number, actually, which is pretty important. In a lot of the models, where you sit on the plane and where you're, like which class you're sitting on really affects your personal emissions from the flight. For instance, first class, emits way more greenhouse gases per person than you would flying in economy.